It is great to be joined today by Congressman Ro Khanna, who represents California's 17th congressional district located in Silicon Valley and the Bay Area. Among his many characteristics is notable that he takes no corporate PAC money. We'll also talk about some of his progressive stances. Congressman, thank you so much for being here today.
David, thank you for having me on.
So to begin with, let's talk about this issue of not taking corporate PAC money. I've seen this as a potentially really important sort of incremental move in the direction of getting money out of politics. And it can be very hard when we talk about that because it's such a big issue to imagine the endpoint where we ultimately want to be. But it seems that that's something that every candidate and elected official can choose to do right now. In other words, they don't need a constitutional amendment to do that. They don't need to change the law. They can just say, this is something I can do. Do you see it as a sort of logical, incremental step in that direction?
I do. When I got to Congress, I formed the No PAC caucus along with Beto O'Rourke. And I know when we did that, it was very controversial. There were only 7 of us who didn't take PAC money out of 435 members of Congress. And even some of those 7 who didn't take PAC money didn't want to be affiliated with the No PAC caucus for fear of offending their colleagues. I think you've seen the success of Beto's campaign in Texas to show that not taking PAC money is actually a politically savvy move. And Connor Lamb, who doesn't share my politics, he's much more moderate. He ran on not taking PAC money in a moderate district. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez ran on it in a liberal district. I think it's something that cuts across ideology, and it's something that signals to voters that you want to change the system. Now, we need to go much beyond not taking PAC money because the reality is I still take contributions, as do most people, from individuals who are wealthy. There are a lot of contributions that come from the max $2,700, and that gives a disproportionate voice not to a single individual, but to a given set class of individuals. Only 5% or so Americans contribute to political campaigns. So I propose with Russ Feingold this bill, Democracy Dollars, to give every American citizen $50 to contribute to campaigns. I think that's the kind of radical transformation that we need for a democracy. But no PACs is an important first step.
Yeah, I was with Bakari Sellers over the weekend in Los Angeles at Politicon, and he uses this term unilateral disarmament when it comes to a lot of political issues, but also the issue of accepting money. And to some degree, you're not going to win if you just say, I'm going to give up every element of how politics are financed. So to a certain degree, you sort of need to make that calculation. But in thinking about that, what would be the next step? Like after no corporate PAC money, what do you see as the next intermediate step in the direction that we ultimately want to go?
I think looking at what Bernie Sanders accomplished at a presidential level and what Beto accomplished at a senatorial level, and that is expanding small dollar contributions. And Alexandria did this to some extent in her congressional campaign. The challenge is, how do you expand your small dollar donor base on social media, through organizing? And how do you do that if you're not a celebrity, right? I mean, Bernie Sanders obviously had a celebrity factor, and Beto and Ocasio, to some extent, by the end, got a celebrity factor. But is there an institutional way that progressives can organize so that candidates for Congress who may not be very famous or get a ton of media attention can still develop grassroots donor bases and be less reliant on max out contributions? And I think all of us need to work towards doing it. So don't take PAC money and expand grassroots fundraising, I think, are 2 intermediate steps.
So I want to stick with sort of financial or economic, money-related issues for a little bit. Being a representative of Silicon Valley, you follow closely what happens with some of these large corporations which provide very useful products and services. There's no doubt they create jobs, but also they do receive the lion's share of some of the benefits of the status quo system that we have. So I want to talk about the Amazon $15 minimum wage a little bit. I have my thoughts on it, and I know you have an interesting take on it. What was your reaction when you saw that Amazon was raising its minimum wage company-wide to $15?
Well, I think it was in part response to Senator Sanders and I introducing the Stop Bezos Act, We basically called on Jeff Bezos about a month before he increased his minimum wage to do so. And we said it's ridiculous that Amazon is $1 trillion company and that yet they're not paying their workers enough. And their workers are actually relying on food stamps and public benefits. And taxpayers are having to subsidize employees at the richest company in the world. And that the worker conditions aren't up to standard in some of the warehouses. They haven't allowed unionization. And we explicitly said to Jeff Bezos, be the Henry Ford of your time, raise wages. In direct response to that, Bezos said, I've heard my critics, and he, in fact, tagged Senator Sanders, and he said that he was going to raise wages to $15. In some sense, it was a vindication for Senator Sanders and I because we were attacked mercilessly by the Beltway for going after Jeff Bezos. Now, it's not perfect. Jeff Bezos took away stock options from workers who were not minimum wage workers, but middle income workers, and he's taken away some of the bonuses. As I understand it, 350,000 Amazon employees are still going to get a pay raise, and net, they're better off. I wish he didn't take away those bonuses, but I still think it was a step in the right direction.
And to some degree, I mean, there's no doubt that it's the right decision. At the same time, we all know it's calculated and that there's a PR benefit that also has a financial value sort of attached to it. And I think it can be sometimes tricky for progressives in these situations. You don't want to be seen as poo-pooing anything that these corporations do when they do the right thing. At the same time, it's important and sometimes difficult, I would argue, to couch it in a context where this is sort of like safe activism, right? Whether they pay $12, $15, or $18, the status quo in which they can circumvent the tax law to avoid paying taxes legally and all of this other stuff, it doesn't change that. And I think it does make it so that progressives have to think carefully about how to react to decisions like this.
I agree. I mean, it doesn't change the fact that they may not be supportive of unionization. It doesn't change the fact that they're paid 0% corporate tax in 2017. It doesn't change the fact that we have to be vigilant to make sure they don't acquire a monopoly power in different industries. At the same time, we do have to, in my view, acknowledge when companies try to take a step in the right direction, so that there are other companies like Walmart or McDonald's who feel the same incentive. So that's also a job for people like you. I mean, politicians, we're going to celebrate if there's a concrete outcome of success, but I think you have to hold not just the politicians accountable, but also corporations accountable to say, okay, it's a step in the right direction, but we still need far more structural change.
Can you talk a little bit right now about who you think can most effectively hold corporations accountable? And to contextualize the question, trial lawyers are very divisive and controversial. On the one hand, you hear a lot of critics of trial lawyers, including friends of ours down at Levin Papantonio in Pensacola, Florida, Mike Papantonio, host of Ring of Fire, and others who are doing really, really great work. You hear criticisms about so-called trial lawyers that they get 30% of all the settlement money that should go to individuals and all sorts of critiques of self-enrichment. But at the same time, these corporations have such financial resources. It can take millions of dollars to even get somebody like DuPont, for example, to trial. Who other than these well-resourced law firms can actually do it? So I'd love to hear from you a little bit about what are the institutions that can actually hold corporations accountable in a real way?
I think the United States Congress can, as Bernie Sanders showed. By telling people stories and using the bully pulpit of Congress effectively, you can really embarrass corporations into thinking that there's a PR cost for them if they are not treating their workers well. The other folks who can hold corporations accountable are the workers themselves. It takes great courage for workers at these companies to come forward and tell their stories. But when they do, when they organize and when they share those stories, and when you have journalists like yourself amplify those stories on social media, I think that puts tremendous pressure on corporations. So we shouldn't underestimate the role of the bully pulpit in getting corporations to do the right thing. We also need to look at the rules, though, of our free market system, rules that right now have benefited stockholders and those receiving dividends over workers. And we need to rewrite some of those rules to make sure that you don't have stock buybacks, to make sure that you do have workers represented on the boards of these companies, to make sure that you have environments that permit unionization. And those are things that Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Sherrod Brown have talked about, and that if we have a majority in Congress, we should try to pass.
Yeah, in part two, I definitely want to touch on what would be the immediate to-dos if indeed the Democrats take over the House very, very soon in the midterm elections. But before we get to that, you mentioned independent media a couple of times. I am curious, I mean, how much do folks in Congress know about this sort of growing tide of independent media outlets, these sort of alternatives to corporate media that increasingly have larger and larger audiences? Sometimes it can feel from our end like we're sort of just talking here, and we don't know whether those who are actually in positions of power know about independent media. Is this, I mean, how do you characterize that? Are people there aware of what we're doing?
The savvy ones are. You know who was aware of independent media is Donald Trump. He spent hours and hours giving interviews, not just to cable news, but to the right-wing alternative media, going on radio stations and radio programs, going and talking to internet bloggers. And he was very savvy about that. I think progressive politicians need to realize that going on CNN and MSNBC and having an article in the New York Times is not sufficient, that many people listen to alternative media, and that it's a huge strategic advantage to get your message out. And I do think people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and some others have realized that, and that's to their advantage. So I think many people listen to you, and those politicians who don't take it seriously are hurting their own strategic interests of how to get a message out.
We have been speaking with Congressman Ro Khanna, who represents California's 17th Congressional District, located in Silicon Valley, San Francisco Bay Area. We will pause our conversation with him there and continue tomorrow. We are continuing our conversation with Congressman Ro Khanna, who represents California's 17th Congressional District. To pick up our conversation, Congressman, you have taken a very, I believe, principled approach when it comes to the issue of our relationship with Saudi Arabia. And this relates to Yemen. This relates to the recent death of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. This relates to the arms deals. What can be done? Because it does seem to some degree like an exercise in futility, this relationship that is in great part based on sort of a shared interest in Middle East stability, concerns around oil, concerns around arms deals. I mean, is this thing too big to really interrupt?
I don't think so. Even in my time in Congress, I've noticed a shift in public opinion and an opinion on the Hill. I started sounding the alarm about Yemen 3 months into my term in Congress. I was concerned about the humanitarian crisis there. And more, I was concerned that we don't get suckered into another war in the Middle East. The neoconservatives wanted us to support the Saudis' efforts in Yemen as a counter to Iran and as a check on Iran. They have been clamoring for us to get into a conflict with Iran, and I thought that that would be a disaster. Since that time, when I introduced the War Powers Resolution to stop our aid for the Saudis, there has been growing consensus that this war must stop. A part of it is 14 million people, 12 to 14 million Yemenis face possible famine. I mean, that's incomprehensible. 800,000 people died in Rwanda. Here you're looking at a scale of famine that is just mind-blowing. And that has finally, I think, post-Khashoggi, awakened the conscience of many members of Congress. They realized that Khashoggi was actually writing about the Yemen war. That's one of the reasons he was murdered. So now we have a growing number of people in Congress who recognize that the war must stop. Even Secretary Mattis yesterday talked about the war in Yemen stopping. There are a growing number of folks who are questioning the Saudi relationship. We just need continued citizen mobilization. We need to continue to fight for this. But I think this is a issue that we can win, and we must win, given the number of lives at stake.
How concerned are you about this sort of being enamored or impressed by authoritarian types by the current president right now? And this applies to Rodrigo Duterte, this applies to Kim Jong un, this applies to Bashar al Assad, it certainly applies to the Saudi royal family. Is that a media only story, or does that have real world diplomatic impact?
No, I am concerned that this president hasn't spoken out clearly on human rights and seems to be indifferent to human suffering or human rights when he deals with dictators abroad. His instincts as a candidate to have less intervention overseas, I thought, were promising, in his sense that we wanted to reset the U.S. Russia relationship to avoid another Cold War, that we shouldn't be intervening in Syria, that we should pull our troops out of Afghanistan. All of that, I thought, was a necessary course correction from a neoconservative foreign policy. But having restraint in foreign policy doesn't mean that we ignore human rights abuses. We can believe that we shouldn't be intervening militarily in Syria, but still believe that Assad is a brutal, terrible dictator and speak out against his human rights abuses and call for International Criminal Court of Justice to deal with war crimes. We can believe that we shouldn't be intervening in the Middle East, but still recognize the human rights abuses of the Saudis. And when it comes to human rights, this president has had a blind spot that is not consistent with American values. I tend to look to John Quincy Adams, who said we shouldn't be intervening abroad, but we should always have our prayers, our hopes, our moral expressions on the side of those who stand for freedom and human rights.
So, if Democrats do take over the House in November, ultimately in January, they would be sworn in, but not the Senate. What are the priorities? Do they relate to geopolitics and foreign policy? Is it domestic policy? Is it economic versus social? And obviously, you have to kind of balance that with the pragmatism of what can you do at this point, in all likelihood, without a Democratic Senate. What are your top priorities?
Well, I think they're connected. We should stop the wars overseas and the trillions of dollars we've spent overseas and put that money into developing our own nation, our own education, our own infrastructure. The Republicans have been for war overseas and for tax cuts for billionaires, for giving people like Sheldon Adelson a $670 million tax break. The Democrats should say, we don't want that money going into conflicts we can't win or to the billionaire class. We want that money going in to rebuild communities, to create jobs, to fund community colleges, to provide internet for everyone, to provide health care for everyone through Medicare for all, to fight for a $15 minimum wage, to build our infrastructure. That what is urgent for America in the 21st century is to rebuild communities and to rebuild this country so that everyone has an economic shot. So I think that the two are actually linked in terms of foreign policy and economic policy. When you talk about foreign policy abstractly and say Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Iran, people may glaze over. But when you put it in terms that trillions of dollars are going overseas in conflicts we can't win, and that money should be helping their kids have a better economic future, I think people get it.
When it comes to some of the specific elections, I got a bunch of questions from people in the audience that they wanted me to ask
Sure.
you. One is you ultimately supported Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in New York, but after initially supporting Joe Crowley. Some folks want to know what made you initially support Crowley.
Well, I was part of the Congress, and Crowley had come out for Medicare for all, and he had invited me to visit his district in Queens, and there was this brilliant program in Queens that was helping minority community population get tech jobs, and I got connected with them, and so I knew Joe Crowley, and that's why I supported him. But once I became more aware of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the inspiring campaign she was running, I endorsed her and dual endorsed. I was the only member of Congress to do that. It was at some political risk. In retrospect, I wish I had done that right away, but I'm glad that I made that course correction, and I think she's going to be an exceptional candidate. I also think, candidly, I got a lot of feedback on social media about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez that helped me be ahead of the curve and see the extraordinary campaign she was running And so that's another point that people do listen to independent media and social media in making these decisions.
If Democrats do win back the House, will you support Nancy Pelosi as Speaker? A bunch of people asked about this.
Here's why I do. Two reasons. One, there's no progressive alternative. I don't want Steny Hoyer to become Speaker of the House. And if you don't support Nancy, most likely the speakership moves to the right. So for those of folks who want to replace Nancy Pelosi with a progressive alternative, I say, okay, who's the progressive candidate who has the votes to be able to beat her or to be able to beat Steny Hoyer? Second, I think having so many accomplished women run and win, and having the first woman speaker, I think giving Nancy the gavel and then having a transition to a more progressive speakership is what makes the most sense. And it may give us time with all these new progressives like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Rashida Tlaib for the Progressive Caucus to organize to groom someone who's a successor. I think we would lose an election right now to Steny Hoyer or someone else if we didn't have Nancy. So do I think what I do think is we should hold Nancy to commit to supporting a vote on Medicare for all, to supporting a vote for a $15 minimum wage, to supporting an end to the war in Yemen, and try to get as many of our progressive policies be a priority.
Would your vote for her be conditional on her agreeing to get a vote on those issues?
I wouldn't put it as conditional. What I have talked with Mark Pocan and Pramila is that the Progressive Caucus should make it clear what our priorities are and have a meeting with Nancy to try to get that commitment. And I don't believe people respond well to sort of threats and conditional statements. But I think we should be very clear where we stand and where the energy of the party is. And I also think we should be at the same time focused on grooming someone, whether it's Mark or Pramila or someone in the Progressive Caucus who could run to be the next speaker. I'll tell you one person who I'm supporting is Barbara Lee for the House caucus chair. Now, Barbara, if she wins that race, she may be a terrific successor to Nancy. So we need to be pragmatic in making sure that when we move after Nancy, we get a progressive leader and not someone who moves the caucus to the right.
Last thing I want to talk about, and I know you just have a few more minutes to spend with us, and it relates to exactly this conversation we're having, which is that of pragmatism versus idealism. And I talk to a lot of people in my audience who get angry with me when I point out that there are some races where you give away a seat to Republicans by going after the centrist Democrat that is there. However, I fully support the primarying of illiberal Democrats or Democrats that are failing to really be progressive, and there are many of them in the House and as well in the Senate. Can you explain your philosophy for finding that balance between wanting to move to the left and realistically, as quickly as is possible, with not doing self-inflicted damage?
Well, first, I think our party needs to adopt bold progressive proposals. We should be, as a Democratic Party, for Medicare for all. We should be for a $15 minimum wage. We should be for abolishing PAC money, not taking PAC money as candidates or at the DNC. We should be for a $1 trillion infrastructure package. We should be for net neutrality. And we should have progressive standard bearers like Bernie Sanders leading the party and progressives in leadership. Then I say, okay, once the Democrats stand as a progressive party, then we should understand that not everyone in their particular districts is going to agree with all of the progressive platform. And if there's someone running in a more conservative district and they want to depart from the Democratic philosophy, they should be able to do that. And we need to recognize that it's going to take all types of people to build a governing majority. The problem I have now is we don't have a coherent Democratic progressive platform. We have a lowest common denominator, everyone run whatever way they want for their districts. That's not how the conservatives do it. The conservatives have a conservative platform, and then they let the Susan Collins or others in some discrete issues break from the party. I think that would be a model the Democrats should have, a clear progressive standard bearer and platform, but having some flexibility for people in their own districts to tailor that so that we can have a governing majority.
Yeah, that's I've gotten a lot of heat for saying something similar, and people wrote to me and said, David, isn't that a bit of a double standard? Because on the one hand, you're praising the fact that Republicans seem not to have a litmus test and allow people like Susan Collins to be there. But at the same time, you're sort of saying that we need real progressives and instituting some sort of de facto litmus test on the left. How do we balance that? Because we don't want to be hypocrites on it, but I completely agree with the conclusion that you're coming to.
Well, I think there's not a litmus test, in my view, for every district, but there may be certain principles that we say we want our standard bearers to have. So I believe in Medicare for all. I would find it very, very hard to imagine any case where I would support a presidential candidate that doesn't believe in a robust version of Medicare for all. But if there's a district in some part of the country where a candidate is not running on Medicare for all, but is going to beat a Republican so we can have the House of majority, I still may go out and campaign for them. Let me give you an example. Chris Pappas hasn't come out for Medicare for all in New Hampshire. I supported a progressive alternative for him in the primary, but now that he's the nominee, I want to make sure he wins. But I don't want Chris Pappas being my presidential nominee. So I think there has to be a clear set of priorities that our leaders embrace, but there has to be some flexibility district by district to build a governing majority. That's at least my perspective. I know different people have different views on this, but it's a tough question.
We've been speaking with Congressman Ro Khanna, who represents California's 17th congressional district located in Silicon Valley, includes the San Francisco Bay Area. Congressman, really a pleasure having you on. Thank you.
Dave, great to be on. Let's do it again, and I will continue to follow your show.